Yeah, and I have the great pleasure today of working with Simon Roper, who is one of my YouTube idols. I first discovered Simon in a wonderful video he did on pretending to be an Old English speaker. And then I've been following him avidly ever since. I love his ability to do accents. It's amazing. And the narratives that he writes, so the dialogues are fantastic, and just storytelling skills, and of course research skills. So it's fabulous to be working together. Half of this video is going to be on my channel and half it on Simon's, and we'll edit it in such a way that it doesn't matter which order you watch them in. And the link will be the link to the other one is below.
Well, we're talking about the emergence of American English as a separate thing from British English, which is obviously a very complicated question, because not only are there lots of dialects of both nowadays, but there's also all kinds of other input languages to American English, and the colonial history is very complicated, and I would say maybe surprisingly under-recorded phonetically, given how recently it happened. So I think thanks to Dave reaching out, I think we've actually found a decent bit of meat to talk about, even if some things will inevitably end up being kind of inconclusive. I think we have, in our research, come across a lot of interesting things that I didn't realise existed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it's been kind of not as clear-cut and not as obvious and not as easy to research as we thought it was going to be. That I kind of imagined that there would be lots of commentary about, these people the other side of an ocean suddenly starting talking differently, but there isn't as much as we imagined.
Yeah, especially with the fact that phonetic descriptions have been a thing for, well, I suppose they kind of emerged around when early colonisation happened. But you would expect someone to, well, I suppose people did take an academic interest in it, but you'd expect it to be more, or I suppose the people that took an academic interest were more describing American English as its own entity rather than describing the differences. And then even Ellis, who is obviously very interested in dialects and seems to have been quite a good phonetician, only makes a few passing comments about it, maybe because his works were very large in scope anyway, and it wouldn't have made much sense to, or he probably just didn't have time or the resources to go to the US and actually explore things.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because especially in the early days of the American colonies, most people in Britain wouldn't have really ever met an American. I mean, there weren't very many of them.
Yeah, that is true.
And so what was more noticed was like lexical differences, because people were reading things that people were more likely to read something that an American wrote than to actually have a conversation with one.
I suppose that's a very good point. That'd be impossible for most people to really know about. Most of the spelling differences that emerged were more to do with standardising the system across the board rather than making reflecting American sound changes.
I mean, when Webster decided that he didn't like U's in words that had come from French or from Anglo-Norman, it wasn't because people this side of the Atlantic said colour differently to people on your side of the Atlantic. It was just he didn't like U's in those words.
One of the first things that we were thinking about talking about in your layout sort of thing that you wrote was the initial divergence and things like where were the colonists from that would have laid the sort of groundwork, accents. I found this surprisingly complicated to research. There's the place I always go first is the Cambridge History of English, because it has very good phonetic accounts that still hold up, even sort of 20 or so years after it was written. The one relevant to American English is volume 6, I think, and it's the chapter by John Hurt Fisher who discusses some of the sources on where the original colonists came from. He says that initially 95%, well, he cites an older source saying that 95% of immigrants were from Britain initially. And he says in particular they were from East Anglia to New England, from the southwest, so I assume the West Country, to Virginia and Chesapeake Bay, which is interesting because I think that's an area where famously there are some very conservative dialects that kind of sound a bit draconian nowadays. And then from the North Midlands and Wales to the Delaware Valley and Pennsylvania, and then from the North Border regions of England, Scotland, and Ulster to the New England backcountry. This is one thing. A lot of, I think, people, the Anglosphere over, like to think about my dialect has influence from this and from this and from Old Norse, and whatever. And I think that's a very understandable way of thinking about it, which is often kind of right. But I think it's because maybe people who haven't looked too much into historical linguistics maybe underestimate the extent to which dialects and accents can just evolve on their own rather than being externally influenced. Because I suppose a lot of cases we see today, it's more obvious when, you know, there's been a diaspora communities come into a city, and then that's obviously caused some changes in pronunciation, and we don't quite so much notice the organic internal changes in pronunciation. So I think when we started doing this research, looking at the distribution of features, my instinct at first was that a lot of the dialectal diversity that we're aware of in early 1600s Britain, which isn't, we don't have a very, very high resolution view of that because obviously there's no audio recording, but we do have petitions, descriptions and things, is fairly divorced from the dialectal diversity that we see in American English now. So one example I put in the document was modern American English dialects tend to be differentiated by the fact that they have different realizations of the vowels in words like face and goat. So in some places it might be more like, I'm going to do it badly now, I have to do it on the spot, but more like face with a higher first element. And then in other places it might be something more like face, fate, I can't do it very well, but you know what I mean, with a lower first element.
Yeah.
And all of the evidence that we have suggests that the face vowel in England around 1600 was a monophthong like face, which is now pretty much not non-existent in America. I think we decided that maybe, was it Ohio or somewhere like that, but very rare in.
I can't remember. There was more. I think we talked more about monophthongal goats.
Oh yeah. I think that's. I was thinking of face as a parallel.
Like in Minnesota and.
Minnesota, that's where I was thinking of. Sorry. Yeah. So that's a point where there's, to me, it seems like the evidence we have almost certainly points to a diversifying while in the US or while in America, rather than, you know, this dialect went to, you know, Massachusetts and this dialect went to wherever. That's my perspective anyway. But
yeah, it's interesting so the idea of dialect mixing, where you would kind of expect maybe, you know, this feature from that dialect and this feature from that dialect together, but you actually get new stuff. And I think, and you mentioned kind of, you know, people migrating to big cities, and you've got in the UK the emergence of MLE, multicultural London English, and I think also other varieties that are less well documented and less talked about. If you look at multi-ethnic dialects that grow up in big cities where there's lots of migration, you'd expect them to have lots of features in common with the source dialects. So if you take MLE, multicultural London English, the source dialects are Cockney, which drops H's, Caribbean English and various English-based Caribbean Creoles, which drop H's, and then English from many other parts of the world, including Bengali-speaking areas of India and Bangladesh, which typically don't drop H's. MLE then stands out among current British accents in not dropping H's.
We talked about Scouse as well. Scouse is fairly robustly non-rhotic. The R's aren't pronounced after vowels or immediately before consonants, or pauses in speech. But a lot of the dialects that it has other obvious influence from, like Irish English, pretty widely rhotic. And actually, Lancashire is a county in the northwest of England that's famous for having a lot of rhoticity, and Liverpool is just next to Lancashire. In fact, it may even have been in it at one point. I'm not sure before.
Yeah, it might have been. I can't remember. Yeah.
So there's another case where you sort of, if you were predicting what that that merger of dialects would produce, you'd sort of expect it to be rhotic, but it's turned out not to be. So
yeah,
really,
and Boston English as well, which has a very, very strong, stratum of Irish, Southern Irish mostly, and yet kind of strongly non-rhotic.
Yeah, famously non-rhotic.
Yeah.
That's one thing, is that parts of the US where I anecdotally hear a lot of sort of people talking about Scotch-Irish influence are, places like Boston and also the South, which are the more non-rhotic areas historically, which is interesting because as we've seen, maybe there is some strange way in which influence can cause unexpected features like that to happen, or maybe it's just like we were saying earlier, that internal developments are more powerful than external influences in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I mean, I think a strong force in all of this is dialect levelling, where you get people from a mixture of communities who are kind of thrust together in a new place, and their kids develop a new way of speaking that's influenced by some features of the adult language, but that it develops an identity of its own, that they're forging their own identity, and therefore they create this new form of language. And I think MLE is one of the most interesting modern examples of that, because we've actually seen it happen. I mean, in my lifetime, that accent didn't exist, and it didn't really start to be noticed until the 1980s. So that has been born out of immigrant communities in Eastern London, and so kids whose parents spoke Cockney, kids whose parents spoke various various forms of Caribbean English or Caribbean English Creoles, people from the South Asian continent, and various other people, all kind of coming together, and their kids forging one identity that is exemplified by this new way of speaking that developed out of that. Well, kind of some features out of nothing, and it's homogenous.
Yeah. Emily was a really, I think that was one of the really nice ideas I think that you had while we were researching this, was to think about MLE. I've found myself struggling to know where to start with researching it, and I think that's partly because all my university subscriptions to academic journals are now gone. So I realised that I had a lot less access than I had not that long ago. I think that's a very interesting example of even when a language is already established, because obviously English was obviously extremely well established in London before the 1970s. there can still be very major influence in a very short span of time by migration. So I think in cases where after the main migrations, the main initial migrations of Europeans to America had already happened, you get things like in Boston, I think, in a lot of the Italian and Irish immigration that now sort of characterises it happened, I think, in the 1800s rather than in the 1700s. That was building on the foundation of, I think, mostly English Puritan migrations that had happened previously. It shows the effect of later migration and how big that can be on the eventual phonetic situation.
And you get this. So there's the kind of. So there's thinking about Australia, where you get quite small numbers of people, but from mostly from southeastern England, but quite a lot of people from the rest of the country, and people from a wide range of social classes. Suddenly all thrust together in small communities. And so you get this, you get kind of proto-Australian English developing out of those. And then that kind of that kind of creates the basis. And then other groups come in. So you start having immigration into Australia from Greece and Italy and other southern European countries. And things are added in. So there's a form of an English accent that's spoken in Melbourne with an unfortunate name that I won't use because it means something very different in the UK.
Right.
But where you get Greek influence, and it's kind of it's markedly kind of Greek Australian, but its basis is still Australian because that was the identity that people coming in kind of aspired to. And I was just thinking about like Italian American English, where you get features like, I'm imagining these were not original. The dental T's and D's that you get in like classical Brooklyn may have come from Italian, but at the same time you get kind of very American whether you get this interesting thing where you get Sicilian pronunciation of foodstuffs, but are then Americanized.
Right. Is this way? Because I've heard a lot of like in semi-exaggerated versions of those accents. I've heard a lot of like foodstuffs that have what I would have assumed would be the final vowels of Italian omitted in the American version. Is that that kind of thing?
Yeah. And like unaspirated stops becoming voiced. So there's, and I can't remember what the original Italian for this is, but there's some food stuff called gabagool.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so, I mean, Southern Italian accents lose final consonants.
Right. Okay. That is very interesting. I never looked into the discrepant what I perceived as discrepancies between Italian and Italian American English, but I did wonder if it was a dialectal thing in some Italian language or something that had carried on. But that does make sense. Yeah, that's very interesting.
What I mean, your speciality is, well, one of your many specialities is archaeology, and you're really interested in like Old English. What was that like, as far as we know, of people coming in? So you get these people who are speaking like different varieties of North. Was it called? West Germanic.
West Germanic, but I mean, there's smaller categorizations, and I don't know.
Ingvaeonic or something. I can't remember the name.
Yeah, Ingvaeonic.
But basically, they didn't all talk the same, and then they end up in different parts of England and southern Scotland originally. So, what do you know how mixed those communities were?
I don't know from an archaeological angle. I should have looked more into that, but I've been led to believe, at least by lecturers and things, that it's a lot more complicated than the Angles, Saxons, Frisians, Jutes kind of thing, which was, I think that's from a text by Bede that was written 200 or 300 years after the events he was describing. And that whole thing had kind of stuck in archaeology for quite a long time, and people had noticed regional differences in things like brooch design and stuff like that, and then tried to map that onto this is the Anglian brooch, these are the Anglian brooches, these are the... And you get descriptions like that in dialectology as well. You have West Saxon and Kentish, which are the sort of southern dialects, and then Northumbrian and Mercian are grouped together as the Anglian dialects. And my understanding is that that's probably oversimplified as far as the original kind of West Germanic dialect continuum goes. One of the reasons it's oversimplified is because we're not entirely sure exactly how Bede's kind of ethnonyms for these people actually correspond to geography. In some places, there are obviously connections with modern words and modern place names and things, but I don't really think anyone's quite sure who the Jutes were or where they ended up, or
So that neat thing of like the Jutes came from Jutland and moved to Kent is just kind of so I suppose he's writing 300 years later, and probably based on oral histories that were passed down.
I imagine.
And there is that human desire to classify and analyze and classify and simplify. So it's much nicer to be able to say, right, there's these Jutes, they came from there and they moved to there.
Yeah.
And then these people, they were the Saxons, they came from there.
That's the thing. I think I think the Jute thing is one of the more difficult ones, because obviously there's the name connection with Jutland, but I think I think the connection with the location is kind of spurious. Somebody could correct me in the comments, and I'll try and look for a source afterwards. But another thing is, would that have been a North Germanic language or a West Germanic language even at that time? So, and you do see in the dialects of Old English that start getting written down, you see some sort of weird patterns where, in some cases, most Old English dialects or Old English texts south of a certain point will show things in common with Frisian on the continent, so palatalization and things like that. Old English and Frisian have slightly different palatalization. I think it's maybe less advanced in Frisian. But then you have Northumbrian, which into the Middle English period showed evidence of a much less extreme version of that palatalization that didn't affect things like final g, which turned to j in Southern Old English dialect. So at the same time, you have these splits which do look very much as though they're retained from the continental dialects. So I would say that's maybe an example that shows you can have those splits be retained after a sort of migration period, and that they can survive for a long time. But why that happened, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know how long or to what extent the communities were isolated from each other. But you'd assume that in a country as small as England, relative to a country as large as like the whole east coast of North America, I would have thought that easily, obviously, North America could have sustained a split from Europe if the circumstances had been right. But as I said earlier, I don't think I don't see much evidence that it did, at least not for very long. But obviously that's just my own opinion. And then later you have Old Norse.
Were Anglo-Saxons popping back to Anglia and Saxony to see their gran?
I'm not sure. I don't know if there'd be any... I suppose you could probably do something with like stable isotopes if Yeah, I suppose you might be able to find stable isotope evidence that someone had been born in England and then gone back, but I don't know if there's any examples of it.
Because you think they would. I mean, they hadn't. It wasn't like they were, as we know, they weren't kind of expelled from continental Europe.
I imagine there'd probably be, that kind of cohesion would probably be important, wouldn't it? But
you'd imagine. I mean, I suppose if you take your entire extended family with you,
it depends where in the country you are as well, because I think a lot of Anglo-Scandinavian archaeology is. I looked into that a little bit in my third year at uni, which I may well not be that well informed about it now. But yeah, a lot of the north of England, I think because there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil, or it's very acidic, or something like that, it's not very good for preservation. There are a lot of upland areas that just aren't very good for preservation anyway. And so how Old Norse speakers were integrated into society is a big kind of question mark. A lot of what we have is just the sheer fact that traditional dialects in the north have, well, English in general has a lot of Old Norse vocabulary in its core vocabulary. The very common words that are more resistant to being replaced normally through loaning. And northern dialects, traditional northern dialects, that's especially true of. So I think you'd have to study it more to say this conclusively, but to me it suggests some kind of situation where people were probably raising their children bilingual fairly often, or there's me correcting myself, at least a certain level of bilingualism, maybe people interacting on a normal colloquial level rather than there being some lord, baron, whatever, that's just conjecture that I don't know if that's. But this is the point. Archaeology doesn't really help.
Well, I mean, I think it's likely, isn't it, that one, as you say, you've got very core elements of vocabulary that get replaced. Some of which, so I mean, the personal pronouns. There were sound changes that made the Old English for he and they sound very similar to each other. But if it hadn't been a Norse word, those sound changes would have fixed themselves. Or people would have said he for he and he dem for
that's true.
For they or something.
Yeah, that would have been interesting.
They've had to have some Jamaicans come in and suggest that. But,
there might be
speakers.
900-year or so gap in the middle.
Hey, come on, we could have a plural there. That would be good. We could just say he dem.
That would be.
There's a monk I found with my the video I did about the Scots language. This 12th century monk complaining about how the Condry langage has been spoiled by people speaking Norman and having Norman and Norse words in their English. And the irony is that both country and language are Norman. So this kind of, Daily Mail reader from some abbey in Northumbria is complaining about people using Norman words in their English, and he's using words complaining.
I wonder if it was a case of there was a more conservative set of Norman words that were okay, and
that been there longer.
yeah, that's very funny. I'm trying to think if there was any other examples. Well, I scribbled something down about. Obviously, actually, this is a good segue into it. The would we expect any kind of prescriptive commentary from either side? Would we expect Americans to be going, "Oh, they've stopped speaking properly in Britain," or the inverse from British people? Obviously, I think Alexander Ellis himself, who will revisit later on, who was writing in the 1860s to 90s, he made the comment that I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but the pronunciations that are decried in one century often turn out to be the normal ones in the next century, which was a very. It's good to know that somebody in the 1800s was on the money with that. Because you do see things in the late 1700s of people describing things as vulgar. I find there's normally some level of self-awareness of the fact that it's flipping back and forth a little bit. But yeah, so I suppose one potential avenue that we've been looking at is when people do make those prescriptive comments, it's quite useful. And I think Noah Webster, you found a few that Noah Webster had made about other American dialects other than his own.
Noah Webster had some critical remarks to make about the dialectal peculiarities of fellow Americans. He complained about the drawling, whining cant of rural New Englanders, saying they pronounce their words in a careless, lazy manner, or the sound finds a passage through the nose. Also, they omitted the aspiration in words beginning with WH, so white and whip became white and whip, and pronounced the E before R like A, as Marcy for mercy, in Webster's words. Other regions also used what Webster considered idiosyncratic pronunciations. Speakers in Boston and Philadelphia often substituted W for V, Wessel for vessel. Southerners tended to drop the R after vowels. In the middle regions of the country, people pronounced the vowel in words like off, soft, drop, and crop, with the R sound of hot. Off, soft, drop, crop, according to Webster. They also gave once and twice a final T. Onced and twiced.
Probably the purpose of them was to slag off other Americans, to maybe not, I don't know, maybe that's too cynical, but inadvertently they end up telling us about dialectal differences.
Yeah. So because we talked about dialect leveling, but there's the other. It pulls the other way as well. It's an interesting dynamic in that there's also the idea, and I think this very, very strong. You find this very, very strongly in Yankee communities. So in those kind of the New England descendants, where people are saying we must preserve the language. So it's changing naturally. And I suppose it's a generational thing as well. The kids are starting to invent a whole new way of speaking, and they're tugging their pearls and saying, "No, we must preserve the values we brought with us."
It's funny, people find like very specific ways of justifying their brand of prescriptivism.
So the other half of this conversation is over on Simon's channel, and there's a link below, and hopefully one there as well. And I hope you'll find it as interesting as you found this one.